Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association webinar, The Missing Piece, How Housing Policy Benefits from a Socioeconomic Perspective. I'm Kristen Holinsky, Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives here at CHRA, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'll just give you a brief overview of the webinar technology, and I'll then introduce our agenda and speaker for this afternoon's presentation. So today's webinar is in real time. We're now live. You should be able to see a title screen of today's presentation and be able to hear me via your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you've chosen to dial in. You're currently all muted, and we do this to minimize background noise. However, if you wish to ask questions, which we strongly encourage you to do, you have the choice of typing your question into the dialog box on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation. And we'll address as many questions as we can at the end of Nick's presentation. If at any point you're having problems with the technology, please call Melina Bouchard at the CHRA office. Her contact information is available in the dialogue control panel on your screen right now, or she can be reached at 613-594-3007, extension 19. Moving on to the agenda for today, CHRA is really pleased to have with us Nick Falvo, Director of Research and Data with the Calgary Homeless Foundation. Today's webinar will set the stage for a candid look at the role of broader social and economic drivers impacting the nonprofit housing sector as well as homelessness across Canada. We'll discuss how unemployment, taxation, recessions, social spending, and income assistance impacts the social housing landscape, and to the importance of understanding and relating these impacts to advancing housing policy analysis, advocacy, and debate. Where might this approach take us, and how might it affect affordable housing outcomes? Well, be sure to provide your questions and comments along the way for a fulsome discussion. So I now have the pleasure of introducing to you Nick Falvo, Director of Research and Data with the Calgary Homeless Foundation. His area of research is social policy with a focus on poverty, housing, homelessness, and social assistance. Nick has a PhD in public policy from Carleton University. He's fluently bilingual. He's a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Review of Social Policy. You can follow him on Twitter at Nicholas_Falvo. So welcome, Nick, and I now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. I really appreciate this opportunity. Can I assume everyone can hear me okay? Kristen, does that sound like a decent volume to you? Okay, I think it's turned over to me, so I'll keep talking. I was asked some time ago what I would offer if somebody asked me to give advice to people who are new to the affordable housing sector in Canada. And the main piece of advice I gave and said I would want to offer, if I had such an opportunity, would be to talk about broader issues in Canada's economy and broader issues in our broader social welfare system, and to not just talk about housing. And I'd give the same type of advice to somebody who got into the homelessness sector. I would encourage them not just to look at how they're targeting, not just to look at who they're giving housing to or what kind of system they have or what benchmarks they use to, evaluate performance of different organizations. I would encourage them to look at broader socioeconomic issues. And that's what today's presentation is about. I am trouble. Okay, here we go. This is a line graph. It shows federal spending in Canada, federal government spending, and it shows it over time, stretching back, I guess, roughly 30 years there. And it shows it as a percentage of gross domestic product, and it does that because, as most of you know, economists like to show spending as a percentage of GDP over time, because it's a slightly better gauge of, I guess, if you will, the generosity or degree of spending of the government. So if you look at federal government spending as a percentage of GDP in Canada over the past 30 years, you'll see a rather steady downward shift. And you'll see that it went up a little bit after the most recent recession, or after the 2008-2009 recession, but over the past 30 years, it's generally gone down. And I think that's important to be aware of as you struggle as a nonprofit housing provider to understand why there isn't more affordable housing, as you struggle to ask yourself why various levels of government aren't being more generous with their social welfare systems or social assistance or other forms of income assistance. If you're wondering why Canada's federal government doesn't spend more on housing, I think it's good to just be aware that this is the broad trend nationally at the federal level over the past 30 years. Now here's a line graph showing how we tax in Canada. Again, it shows it as a percentage of GDP. Now this is all tax revenue, all orders of government, not just the federal government. It's over roughly a 30-year period as well. And as you'll see, you'll note that it's not an exact mirror image of the previous slide, but that certainly since the mid-1990s, there's been a steady downward shift in taxation in Canada. We don't tax the way we used to. There are some economists who believe that you can have low taxes and lots of spending as well. I think a lot of researchers, though, would argue that the two are rather closely tied together. I would certainly argue that there's a relationship between declining tax revenue and declining spending in Canada. I think the two tend to go hand in hand. They tend to be different sides of the same coin. And you can see from this particular line graph that up until the mid-1990s, for roughly a 10-year period, our taxation in Canada as a percentage of GDP was noticeably above the OECD average, and it's dipped down now to quite a bit below the OECD average. So things have really changed. Some of you will remember where you were, or you'll remember particular announcements. So for example, I remember very well under the Chrétien government, there were a series of tax cuts announced in different budgets. I remember the 2000 federal budget, when $100 billion in tax cuts over 5 years were announced by Paul Martin. A lot of you will remember various tax cuts under the Harper government in Ottawa. You'll remember the cuts to the GST, for example. And this has happened at provincial levels as well. And this is probably something you were wondering about. Here's a line graph showing federal housing investment as a percentage of GDP over time. Not quite the same time span that the other visuals had, but still a rather steady downward trend. Federal housing spending as a percentage of GDP. This isn't going to surprise most of you, because most of you were broadly aware of this trend. Most of you, I think, were broadly aware of the other trends as well. And my fear is that a lot of people who get into the housing sector just think about this visual when they think about the history of Canada's, say, affordable housing policy. But actually, I think it's important to think about the other ones as well. The other visuals, I think, are quite related to this one. Now, all of these visuals in the notes section of the slide deck have the references, and when I say the references, I mean the places where I stole this information from. I say that with my tongue in my cheek because there's full attribution here, so I'm not doing anything I'm not supposed to do. But it is worth mentioning that this is a slide that I stole from Steve Pomeroy. And I say that not only because might get back to him that I used his slide, but also I happen to know he's on the call today. So Steve, I know this is your visual. I stole it from you 3 years ago, but there's full attribution in the references section. Now this is also, like the previous slide, a story a lot of people on this call know about. A lot of you are aware that in Canada we built there was a lot of rental housing built both in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector in the 1970s and 80s. So a lot of you will not be surprised to know that there was a lot of private rental housing in the 60s and 70s. That's the turquoise part of each bar. And a lot of you will not be surprised to see that to see a lot of red showing in the late 60s and in the 1970s. That was public housing. That's when public housing was in its heyday. And a lot of you won't be surprised to see that the pink, there was a lot of pink in the 70s and 80s. That's nonprofit and co-op housing. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise to people that there was a lot built in the 70s, 80s, 60s, and a lot less in the 90s and today. So, but again, I want to go back to the fact that I think this is all related. I don't think it's a coincidence that especially, I don't think it's a coincidence that social housing was much more prominent in the 70s and 80s, at the same time that spending in other initiatives was higher and the taxation was higher. I think these are all related. And this is a story that a lot of you know about as well. This is federal funding for homelessness. When the National Housing Initiative came in 1999, it had an annual value of $341 million. If you adjust for inflation, today it's worth considerably less than that. As of before the last federal budget, it was worth just 35% on an annual basis what it was in 1999. I'm talking about the HPS program today. So as of, say, a year ago, annual federal funding in Canada for homelessness was roughly 35% of its level in 1999. That's a combination of cuts to the program and the erosion of its value due to inflation. Now, a lot of you on the call will also know that in the most recent federal budget, there was a limited time increase, a time-limited increase, I believe over a 2-year period. The Trudeau government did announce an increase in HPS funding that will be valid for about another year now. But even with that increase, it's still a fraction of what it was in 1999. And again, I would encourage you to think about this, but also to think about this and this. I think that the declining federal funding for homelessness, roughly matches the decline in federal government expenditures in general during a similar period, and the decline in taxation. And then that brings us to unemployment. So this is Canada's official unemployment rate, an annual figure over time, stretching back about roughly a 60-year period, and you'll see a trend. You'll see that in the 50s and 60s, Canada's official unemployment rate was quite low. There's even a period there where it was under 4%. And you'll see that it's gone up substantially. It went up substantially in the 80s, and even now, it is nowhere near as low as it was in the 50s. Certainly not as low as the 60s. And this first came on my radar screen when a guy named Greg Sutter, who currently works at the Wellesley Institute, was mentoring me on a paper I wrote about homelessness in Toronto about 7, 8 years ago. And the narrative he told me about was, he said that if you look back in Toronto's history, prior to the 1980s, there was a little bit of homelessness. I think by 1980, there were about 500 people a night sleeping in Toronto emergency shelters. But with the deep recessions of the 80s and 90s, homelessness shot up. It increased by about 300% in Toronto, as measured by shelter occupancy over a 20-year period, and it never really looked back. He said that there were essentially 2 phases in homelessness history in Toronto. The one was pre-1980 and one was post-1980. And we've never gotten back to the lower levels of homelessness experienced before 1980. And certainly it's Greg's position and mine as well that this is almost certainly related to the rise in unemployment experienced during that time. And now we've got what we now call employment insurance in Canada, and what we used to call unemployment insurance. If you look at this line graph stretching back, I guess it's roughly a 30-year period, you'll see that prior to about 1990, over 3/4 of unemployed workers in Canada received regular unemployment insurance benefits. By contrast, the percentage of unemployed workers covered by employment insurance or unemployment insurance dropped sharply in the 1990s, and now fewer than half of unemployed workers in Canada receive regular unemployment insurance benefits. I'm using the term unemployment insurance generically. I'm not using the formal name. And I think that when you combine that with this, the fact that there are far more people out of work today than there used to be. And you look at the fact that of those who are out of work, receipt of jobless benefits is quite low. This starts to spell problems for homelessness and affordable housing in general. Now, I'll bet some of you are wondering, where does this unemployment and reduced unemployment insurance benefits translate to poverty? Well, here's a line graph that John Stapleton has put together that shows it shows the unemployment rate in Ontario over time, and it shows also the percentage of Ontario's population receiving social assistance over time. Now, there are probably some other things going on here. There are some other variables one would want to be careful about accounting for, but if you eyeball this, it's hard to deny a rather close relationship between unemployment and percentage of the population receiving social assistance. This would vary by jurisdiction, and if you look back to the 1980s, you'll even see that it varies over time, what the relationship is. But certainly, I think it's hard to deny a relationship between the two of some sort. You can debate how strong the relationship is, what other factors were important to think about here, how this may vary over time and over jurisdictions, but certainly there appears to be a relationship, and this starts to translate into problems for poverty and affordable housing and homelessness. Now, one thing I'm not going to say, I'm not going to try to tell you what causes what. I'm not going to try to say that what the strength of the relationship is between different independent variables and homelessness, or different independent variables and core housing need. That would be a very difficult argument to make, and that's because in research, a good researcher will tell you that it's difficult to establish causation. A statistician would say that to really establish causation, you need to use randomized controlled trials. And these are hard to do. Some of you will remember there was the at-home chez soi study. That was $110 million to do. And with a price tag like that, it's hard to do these on a variety of questions. So when I say randomized controlled trial, of course, I mean a control group and a treatment group. Treatment group usually gets an intervention, control group doesn't, and over time you keep everything else constant and you see how the two groups change, how they have different outcomes. So not only can randomized control trials be quite expensive, they can also be impractical and unethical at times. And what I mean by that is this: I don't mean that the at-home chez soi study was unethical. That's not the point I'm making right now. The point I'm making is that every time you want to establish causation, if you want to do a randomized control trial, it could be quite impractical and unethical. For example, if you wanted to study what causes homelessness, you might have to round up a group of several thousand people. You would have to give you'd have a theory as to what results in homelessness and what doesn't. You would know in advance to expect certain outcomes, but you'd want to test them. So you might give one group financial benefits so that they don't end up homeless. You might not give another group financial benefits, thinking it might lead them into homelessness. And you can see right away that this would get very difficult. A research ethics board would have some concerns about approving something like this, and it gets very expensive quite quickly. However, I think it is very highly likely that the economic and social factors that I've discussed in the slide presentation so far have played a major role in creating challenges with respect to affordable housing and homelessness. I think it's hard to deny, personally, I think it's hard to deny that this spending trend has no impact on affordable housing or homelessness. Hard to deny that this has no impact, that this has no impact, that this has no impact, that this has no impact. I think sometimes the relationships are clear enough that you can make a strong argument. So what's my advice? One piece of advice is think and reflect and talk about those other factors we've just talked about. Think about spending levels, overall spending levels by senior levels of government. Think about unemployment. Think about taxation. Think about percentage of unemployed workers who are covered by unemployment insurance benefits. Think about the relationship between unemployment and social assistance. Always think about that. Always talk about that. Don't ignore that. Just because you don't see it in front of you every day in your inbox at work doesn't mean it shouldn't be part of your analysis. So that would be my first piece of advice. Second piece of advice is don't exaggerate what you know, and be careful of people who do exaggerate what they know. I've tried to be quite clear about the fact that it's hard to establish causation, and I would encourage other people to do the same. Nevertheless, there are researchers who know better, who nevertheless exaggerate what they know about different outcomes. Don't be one of those people. Be careful about listening to those people. Always remember that what is unknown is often very important. Second point on this slide, don't over-predict. Be careful of people who do. It's really hard to know the strength of the relationship between different independent variables and the variable you're looking at. Reach out to people who understand different areas of the social welfare system. So if you're in Canada and you'd like to know more about social assistance, reach out to somebody like John Stapleton, who's a well-known consultant and researcher on social assistance. Reach out to somebody like Michael Mendelson or other people at the Caledon Institute of Social Policy. Reach out to people at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives who write about income assistance, for example. Don't pretend you have to have all the answers yourself. Also, attend conferences where people talk about these issues. I like attending the annual conference of the Canadian Economics Association. There are a series of sessions I found there that I enjoy. They're sponsored by the Progressive Economics Forum. That's just one example. Now, ideally, your organization would have enough money to be able to go out and hire researchers every time they want a question looked at or every time they want an issue of social policy analyzed. Most of you probably don't have the luxury of being able to hire someone every time you want to. But a lot of you, I'll bet, receive requests from graduate students on a regular basis to come and do a practicum with you. Graduate students can do literature reviews or annotated bibliographies. These are similar. There's a style of annotated bibliography I like where you write about basic information about an article. You have certain headings, like one for methodology, one for time, one for geography, one for findings, and then you might write a paragraph about the article after, and you might have one page devoted to each article that's being studied. You staple these together, there's 10 of them maybe, and you call it an annotated bibliography. A graduate student can do that quite easily. And if they're doing a practicum, you might not even have to pay them. So that can be done quite easily. And I would also say, encourage your staff to read about social policy on a regular basis. Don't encourage them just to read about housing policy or homelessness policy. Encourage them to read about income assistance. Encourage them to read about funding on reserve in Canada. Encourage them to read about funding for seniors. Encourage them to read about unemployment. Specifically, and here I'm going to pick a few favorites, but I recommend people read Thomas Walkham's column in the Toronto Star. He writes 3 columns a week, roughly. I never miss a Tom Walkham column. Lots of what he's saying isn't just social policy or economic policy, but a lot is. Google the Canadian Social Research Newsletter. That is a newsletter that is free. It will arrive in your inbox every Sunday. Don't miss it. I encourage people to read the blog of the Progressive Economics Forum. Just Google Progressive Economics Forum blog. It's an absolute must-read, I think. Read reports and blog posts published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, and the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Most of those publications are free of charge. People I like to follow on Twitter, Rob Gillizo. He's a professor of economics at the University of Victoria. I think he's a real up-and-comer. Seth Klein. Seth works for the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David McDonald, he's an economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ottawa. Trevor Tombe, he's a guy I've come across since moving to Calgary. He's a young economist at the University of Calgary. And Armini Alnesian, probably more of you have heard of her. She's on CBC quite a bit. Thank you. I will now take questions.
Thanks so much, Nick, for that presentation. We've got a couple questions coming in here, so we'll just get started right away. First of all, some of you have asked if you're able to get the slide deck or the PowerPoint presentation following this, and the answer is absolutely yes. If you check back mid next week on the CHRA website under our webinar program tab, this presentation will be posted in full, and the slide deck will be available as well. So you can definitely check that out and get the information there. We have a question, Nick, that's asking for more information on the EI data. And the question is, the EI data would be more valuable if we knew the social assistance statistics. We do not know what proportion have gone back to work versus expiring EI payments. And this might be more relevant to social housing. So would you be able to comment on that?
I can comment a little bit. I wrote my PhD thesis on social assistance, and one of the toughest exercises I had in the thesis was tracking down data on caseloads. So not on benefits. Benefits are the amount of money a person on social assistance gets every month, defined by province. But caseloads. It's hard to know, it's hard to ask, it's hard to get publicly available information on the number of beneficiaries in each province, especially if you want it broken down by household group. And I would argue that in part because it's so hard to get this data, it's also very difficult for researchers to assess how much caseload growth comes down to a loss of receipt of EI benefits. So there's a great paper co-authored by Ron Kneebone and Catherine White from 2011, published in Canadian Public Policy, that does look over time at the impact of various variables on social assistance caseloads. That looks at all household groups together. My thesis looked at this question as it applies only to singles without kids, and I'm hoping to turn that into a journal article. But I mean, point taken, causation is really hard to establish, and it's hard to say with certainty how much of an impact unemployment receipt has on social assistance receipt. This is a subject for ongoing research. If somebody's very keen, I'd encourage them to read the Kneebone and White piece from 2011.
Great, thanks, Nick. Another question here on some of the Twitter names that you gave out, and suggesting that the columnists and Twitter handles, they tend to be progressive in terms of their thinking, so you don't really get as much of a full range of perspectives. Would you suggest anybody to follow from the less progressive side just to get another point of view on the issues?
So first of all, I would not put Trevor Tombe on the left of this political spectrum, and I would also put Rob Gillizo awfully close to the center of this spectrum as well. I would say that some of the better people, if you're looking for someone who's right of center writing about social welfare policy, I'm not sure how many of them are on Twitter. Someone like Stephen Tapp, maybe, from the Parliamentary Budget Office, or formerly of the Parliamentary Budget Office, perhaps. Andrew Coyne from the National Post. I think he writes a lot on social policy, and I would put him on the right of the spectrum as well. I would think about those guys. I would put Michael Mendelson awfully close to the center, although I don't think he's on Twitter. Those would be the names that come to mind off the top of my head.
Okay, great. So got a bit more of a range there. Another question, and it asks, what about the reverse relationship? What's the effect of social housing policy on other social policy areas, relative return on investment?
So that is a really good question. And as I understand, that's often referred to as a social outcomes research. Some people call it outcomes research with respect to social housing. And as I understand, that's largely in its infancy. It's hard to demonstrate the impact of building social housing on other outcomes. I collect a few articles. If somebody wants to email me directly, I'll email them the articles I've got. But again, causation's hard to establish. So it's hard. One of the reasons it's hard for them to be collecting, hard for researchers to do research on this is that it is hard to establish causation. I know that the Toronto Community Housing Company tried to put out a paper about a year ago where they tried to show the impact of social housing on a number of things. My recollection is that they used quite a bit of extrapolation. It may have exaggerated the extent to which these relationships occur over time. But I think the short answer there is that that kind of research is very much in its infancy.
Great, thanks. So moving in a bit of a different direction, a question asking for your thoughts around the effectiveness of portable social housing vouchers that go with or move with those in need of affordable housing.
Yeah, I like that idea. And there are also sometimes people call them demand side approaches to affordable housing. I know that historically in Canada, folks on the left of the political spectrum tended to not like that approach, and folks on the right of the political spectrum tended to favor it. I think in the past 10 or 15 years, roughly, those two perspectives have converged, and that now it's common to hear people talk about the strengths of both approaches. I think there are a few things to watch out for with demand-side approaches. One is that if you're looking at a vulnerable group of people, let's say you want to target a group of people who have serious mental health problems, putting somebody in a building, in a private sector building where most of the other people are, middle income, higher income, isn't necessarily good for community development. And what I mean by that is, if you take an entire building, like say Ottawa Salis in Ottawa, just picking on one, and you make everybody there from the same group of same subpopulation, it's easier to do community development. So it's easier to do a community kitchen. It's easier to do group activities. It's easier to go to the beach as a group someday. It's easier to do budgeting workshops together. So there are advantages of sort of having more purpose-built developments. Also, with demand-side approaches, I worry about the rent costs over time. Steve Pomeroy has done some research on this where he's compared over time the cost of renting units that were owned by for-profit landlords versus the cost of renting units over time that are owned by nonprofit entities. And over roughly a 20-year period in Ottawa, he found that the nonprofit entity, or the units owned by for-profit landlords, their rent costs increased much more quickly than the nonprofit ones. So one needs to be mindful of that. Also, high growth areas of cities, specifically new suburbs, I think they need more affordable housing. And with purpose-built approaches, so supply-side approaches, you can target the new suburbs and make sure they get affordable housing. I think it can be harder to do that with demand-side approaches where you're at the mercy of where a private developer wants to build new units. But I think each approach has its advantages and disadvantages.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. We have a few more questions on the board here, and if anyone still on the line is still interested in asking a question, now's the time to send them in. So it's okay, Nick. We'll take a few more questions.
No.
So here's one asking, is it feasible to eradicate homelessness considering the mobility of people?
Well, I would say in light of the mobility of people, it's good to go national with your goals. So I think that speaks to the fact that it's not good to just ask municipalities or communities to develop their own plans to end homelessness, but rather it's good to push the federal government to work towards ending homelessness. And I know that that's been a major ask of a variety of advocacy groups in Canada, especially as the current federal government tries to develop its national housing strategy. So absolutely, mobility is hugely important. It affects some regions more than others. All the more reason to go national with your objectives.
Great. Question here asking about the role of research coming out of universities in particular on social policy analysis and the issues impacting social housing. Can you comment on that, or the level of research coming out of universities right now, and how that's impacting advocacy organizations and what's happening in social housing and our understanding of it?
I think some university-based researchers do a really good job. I can name a few just off the top of my head. A friend and colleague of mine in Calgary here, Ron Kneebone, publishes material quite often, and when he does publish policy-relevant research, he typically makes it open access. So he publishes it through the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. It's not in a journal. It publishes very quickly. He launches it at public events, and it's immediately disseminated around the country. So Ron's a really good example of someone who, I would say, with relatively small research budget, tends to publish a lot of policy-relevant research in very accessible ways. I think the work of the Homeless Hub has been excellent. And I'm not just saying that because I know Oksana might be on the line. I saw her on the list. I'm saying that because I really believe in the great work they've done. Before the Homeless Hub came around, there would be articles both in academic journals and in gray literature that would get published, and most people interested in that research might never hear about that because there wasn't a good way of disseminating it. And the Homeless Hub's newsletter, their website, and all their other initiatives have done such a phenomenal job of now making it difficult to not see the research when it comes out. So kudos to Oksana and the Homeless Hub and everybody else involved in that effort. I think they've really revolutionized the availability and dissemination of what does get written about by university researchers. I think David Holchansky at the University of Toronto has been good. He was especially active in the late 90s and into the 2000s. His really policy-relevant work and advocacy was hugely helpful in terms of getting affordable housing and homelessness back on the agenda. Those are just some examples. I would note, though, that there is a bit of a perennial challenge in academia. Professors tend to be recruited, hired, and promoted based on the extent to which they publish in academic journals. And that, as I understand, is the main metric on which they're measured. And so when someone like Ron Kneebone publishes in gray literature, he does it in spite of the incentives he has as an academic researcher. So I would love to see universities change. I would love to see universities recruit, hire, and promote based on the extent to which professors write policy-relevant work in open access publications and the extent to which they actively disseminate that research and try to influence public policy. But sadly, universities, I think, are very slow to change.
Interesting to keep that in mind. A bit of a shift here. A couple questions now focusing on advocacy. And so this one asks, in housing policy, is it good or smart to focus policy on a specific group and demographic at a time, say young families or homeless or immigrants, or should policy always be comprehensive?
That is a really, really good question. I it's always a risk, and I think it's always a tough question. So, one approach that a lot of you have seen in the past decade in Canada is for some advocates to focus mostly or exclusively on absolute homelessness. And I think part of the thinking there, and this has happened in the US too, is to get a bit of momentum. You get a bit of political momentum by getting some quick wins, by seeing outcomes and then trying to get traction. And I think that in a lot of cases across North America, this has been quite successful, and affordable housing and homelessness have slowly come back onto the political agenda after the 1990s, which was a really, I think, dark decade for affordable housing and homelessness. Now we're also seeing that shift to specific subgroups of the absolute homeless population. In the US, there's been a strong focus on ending chronic homelessness. I think veterans homelessness, family homelessness, and I know in Canada I'm seeing increased momentum towards pushing to end veterans homelessness. But it does raise a question that I don't have a good answer to, and that's, is it better to go broad and acknowledge the extent to which poverty and reduced social spending in general are real drivers of homelessness, or is it better to pick something that's more doable within a 4-year time span? I don't have a really good answer to that. I think it's important to do both. I think my general advice is don't do one or the other, do both. There's nothing wrong with being broad and talking about poverty in general. And I'm happy to say that the Calgary Homeless Foundation did that in its submission to the National Housing Strategy. So did the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with also shining the light on some specific subgroups and to try to not only prioritize them based on need, but also to pick up some political momentum. So my short and convenient answer is try to do both.
Thanks, Nick. And kind of a question here that actually extrapolates on what you were just talking about. The question asks, is the current focus of investment on homelessness therefore reasonable, quote unquote, based on strictly economic criteria?
Well, that's a really good question. It makes me think of that article from the New Yorker from I think 2005 by Malcolm Gladwell called $1 Million Murray, where they focus on this one guy named Murray in Nevada who was estimated to be costing the health and justice systems about $1 million a year. And the point was, just give the guy housing, for God's sake. It's a hell of a lot cheaper than having all these emergency services respond to his need. The challenge here is that is the case for a lot of people who are chronically homeless. It's not the case for all people who are homeless. In other words, on a strict, short-term cost, and with just your costing lens on, for some people the case is clear that giving the person housing is going to be cheaper to taxpayers than not giving them housing and having them rely on health and justice and emergency services. On the other hand, there are some people who are homeless, who are in need, but who were not costing the health and justice systems $1 million or even $20,000 a year. And for those people, the case isn't as clear. A good example of this is with the at-home chez soi study. When the final report came out in 2015, the authors were clear that even for the people they were studying in their study, all of whom had to have a serious mental health challenge, even for that group, strictly on dollars and cents, it actually was more expensive for the group as a whole to provide them with housing first than it was to base it on the status quo. For some of the higher need folks, it was cheaper, but for the group as a whole, it was actually more expensive to do housing first than to not do nothing at all. So it is a tricky argument, and I would say that you got to use the costing argument, and you've got to be honest about it, but you've also got to be honest about the fact that there are some people who were not using a lot of health and justice services before. I think I did blog about this in 2015. If anyone's interested, I can send them the link if you want, where I highlight this. One of the factors I made in that post was that another challenge here is that the department that saves and the department that pays are not always the same department. That's a point that Paul Dowling made to me several years ago. He's a Toronto-based consultant. So maybe justice saves money when the person gets housing, but the Ministry of Health spends the money. So when you have ministers competing for a budget and you have ministers focused on their own portfolios, that brings on a challenge as well.
Great, thanks, Nick. We have a last question here, a few more minutes left. And it's related again to advocacy. So thinking in terms of advocacy and whether you're advocating to any level or order of government, whether federal, provincial, or municipal, how am I thinking more broadly in terms of the socioeconomic analysis that you presented here to us today, how could that change the way that we talk to government about housing issues?
I would encourage you to, just as I recommend, don't just read about housing and homelessness and don't just think about housing and homelessness. I would say when you're communicating to government, don't just talk about housing and homelessness. I would use the visuals that I used in this slide presentation, or variations of them, or updated versions of them, to show declining spending on social policies, show declining spending in other spheres as well, show reduced social assistance benefit levels. Talk about these other things when you're talking to government, and understand that this could help you make your case. So it shows the government that you're sophisticated. It encourages them to think more broadly. It encourages them to think across silos. It also means that if you are approaching them and you're struggling on the ground to keep up with demand, you can help explain why that demand for your services is increasing. And I think just a lasting point I'd make, and if you don't mind, I'd like to just come back to the previous question briefly. I wrote a blog post earlier this year called 10 Things to Know About Central Agencies in Canada. And that was a blog post about Privy Council Office, Department of Finance, and Treasury Board Secretary. Those three are known federally anyway as central agencies, and they each have slightly different names at the provincial and territorial level in Canada. And one of the points made in that blog post is essentially you can convince a cabinet minister in a meeting that $1 spent on housing is going to be result in more than $1 in savings in other spheres. But it's important to be honest about the complete picture, which is that actually that's only the case for some people. And one of the reasons it's important to be honest about that and to show them your fine print or your caveats is that after the minister walks away, you can be darn well sure that if this ask is going to go anywhere, it will be looked at by people at in the central agencies. And those central agencies, they're the bean counters, they're the number crunchers, and they will know right away that they will know about your fine print and they will know about your omissions. So that's where honest advocacy gets really important, because just because you can woo the minister doesn't mean you can woo the people behind the curtain.
Good point. I remember seeing that blog post, Nick. That was a good one. I have a comment here actually from Steve Pomeroy, just to mention that to let everyone know that the article on the recent research that he did on non-shelter incomes for CMHC. It's called Non-Housing Outcomes for Affordable Housing, and he will send it to CHRA, and we can make it available to all of you on the line today. We do have one more question that just came in that's back to homelessness, Nick, if you have a few minutes.
Yeah.
And the question is it possible that the focus on homelessness, therefore, is serving as a human interest distraction from the more general issues of poverty?
I think you do both. And one of the reasons you do both is that no matter how you feel about strategy, I don't think there's much denying that homelessness is a very serious social policy issue. I don't think there's any deny. I mean, if you look at how young homeless people die, if you look at how often pregnant people are giving birth across the country, I think over 100 homeless mothers give birth to a child every year in Edmonton alone. I've heard a similar figure for Toronto. If you look at conditions in emergency shelters with respect to assault, theft, trauma experienced in homeless shelters, if you look at public health problems in homeless shelters, I don't think it's hard to make a strong case that, strategy aside, homelessness is a top social policy problem in Canada. I think that it's important to talk about that while also talking about poverty.
Great. Well, thank you. We've come to the end of our hour, and so I want to thank Nick very much from all of us here at CHRA for joining us on the webinar today. Thank you, Nick. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. CHRA's final webinar of our fall series is going to take place December 13th, and the topic is driving new housing supply across a range of affordability options. And our full winter webinar program will be announced early in the new year, so make sure you check that out. And you can find, as I mentioned, the recording as well as the slide deck for today's presentation on the CHRA website, and you can access that at chra-achru.ca/programs, and it's under the webinar section. So more information will be available there early to mid next week. So thank you very much again, and goodbye until next time. Take care.